today's program, I want to give those who are not so familiar with PANA a little bit more information about who we are. PANA fights to advance the full economic, social, and civic inclusion of refugees in San Diego County, as well as throughout California and across the country. Founded and led by refugees, we use relational organizing and Indigenous community leadership model to build long-term political power in a culturally literate manner. We are here today to reflect on how we radically and boldly reimagine refugee resettlements, and newcomers can meaningfully rebuild a sense of home and belonging in the United States. The past 4 years have been devastating for refugees around the world and here at home. The Muslim and African ban directly harmed our immigrant and refugee communities and put us in a state of fear, separated families, and criminalized many of our loved ones. Further, the Trump administration undermined and dismantled the refugee resettlement program. From 2016 to 2020, the number of refugees admitted into the United States dropped by 86%, with a dismal around 11,000 admitted in fiscal year 2020. The decline in the refugee admissions program comes in a time where the number of refugees worldwide has reached the highest levels since World War II. To make things worse, the global pandemic has exacerbated existing inequities within society, affecting immigrants and refugees exponentially. Now we're with a new administration and have a unique opportunity to center the voices of refugees. Today, we'll be sharing the findings from our new report on the status of refugees across the San Diego region, to be followed by an exciting panel discussion with local and national experts on what policies need to be implemented locally and nationally to reimagine refugee resettlement and ensure the success of our communities long-term. Now I'll pass it on to Janine Ericat, our community organizer at PANA, who will give us a brief overview of the key findings of our San Diego Refugee Experiences report. Oh, you're on mute, Janine.
Wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without being on mute. Thank you, Humaira, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. My name is Janine Ericat, and as Humaira mentioned, I'm going to give a brief overview of our key findings, and we'll link the report in the chat. PANA conducts a biennial survey with refugees in San Diego County to better understand the needs of our communities. The results of these surveys and discussions drive the organization's priorities for the next 2 years. This survey was administered from September to November 2020 by PANA staff with technical support from UCSD. The 77-question survey was completed by a total of 544 refugee community members living in San Diego and examined health, employment, housing, COVID-19, education, safety, and belonging. Of the 544 respondents, 38% were African, predominantly East African Somali, 35% were Middle Eastern Arab, 17% were Afghan, and 11% were Southeast Asian, predominantly Korean. A subset of 60 survey respondents were invited to a total of 7 in-language community conversations, which were focus group discussions regarding the priority issue areas conducted both through Zoom and socially distanced in-person meetings. I'll now cover the key findings of our report. Please drop any questions you have in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them in the Q&A. We found that our communities were facing devastating unemployment rates. As you can see on the graph, 22% of survey respondents are unemployed, which is 3 times higher than San Diego County's unemployment rate of 6.6%. Of the 27% that were working, 84% had a median income of about $18,000 per year, falling well below what the AMI would classify as extremely low income based on the reported income and household size. Dedicating resources for technical training to refugees into jobs that will provide higher wages to provide for their families would alleviate many of the constraints our communities face. Our analysis showed that 2/3 of survey respondents are living in crowded housing, and nearly 1/3 of those are living in severely crowded housing. Addressing this epidemic of hidden homelessness, where families are forced to live in overcrowded spaces, is a critical need that has only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Overcrowded dwellings increase the risk for transmission of COVID-19 because of the lack of space to socially distance and isolate. refugees expressed major concerns over the combination of high rents and suboptimal, overcrowded living conditions. Despite low rates of employment and low income among individuals who are employed, only 31% of respondents reported living in affordable or subsidized housing. The good news is we found that individuals living in affordable housing were 66% less likely to be living in severely crowded settings. This is why it is so crucial to prioritize access to affordable housing for refugee communities. As highlighted in the quote, fear persists in the midst of xenophobic and anti-immigrant political rhetoric. East African respondents were most likely to say that anti-immigrant rhetoric strongly influenced their ability to participate in public life. 65% felt worried about being targeted by a hate crime, speaking up in public, or feeling unwelcome in public spaces. Approximately 12% of respondents said they had definitely or probably experienced a hate crime in the United States. We know this is an undercount due to the stigma, structural barriers, and distrust of law enforcement when it comes to reporting. In community conversations, community members stated they did not report hate crimes because they felt even when they reported, there was inaction on part of law enforcement. Middle Eastern respondents were significantly worried about immigration status, with 72% expressing concern about their own immigration status, to implement policies that build trust with refugee and immigrant communities. Across the board, refugees are facing a severe mental health crisis. This graph differentiates by ethnic groups, but overall, 53% of respondents report anxiety or depression at least half the time or more. The high number of respondents reporting mental health issues is particularly alarming, considering this is a stigmatized topic in many of our communities, which means there could also be a higher rate of individuals suffering from mental health, and emphasizes the need for investment in culturally competent, affordable, and accessible mental health care resources. Additionally, we found that refugee communities are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, and there are high levels of vaccine hesitancy. Only 43% of respondents stated that they would be willing to take the vaccine. However, participants who strongly believed that their healthcare provider was culturally competent were 13 times more likely to trust their advice than participants who strongly disagreed that their provider was culturally competent. The Middle Eastern community, for example, rated higher levels of trust with their healthcare provider due to the fact that they were more likely to speak their native language and come from their culture, thus demonstrating a need to invest in culturally competent healthcare providers to provide education on COVID-19 testing and vaccination to refugee communities in language. Across all communities, refugees are experiencing an increase in food insecurity, job loss, household violence, and issues related to school closures since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see on the graph, over 80% of respondents reported significant job loss in their community since the beginning of the pandemic. Participants expressed concerns about how their inability to find work may leave them unable to care for their families or pay rent during the pandemic. Furthermore, 1 in 5 reported that food insecurity had increased. By and large, this tells us that our refugee communities are disproportionately struggling. Thank you all for your time, and I'll pass it back to Humaira.
Thanks so much, Janine. Appreciate you giving us just a better understanding of what refugees are facing in San Diego. We are so honored to have this esteemed panel with us today to help us unpack these results and have a fuller discussion about resettlement. First, we have with us today Karl Rubinstein. Since 2015, Karl Rubinstein has been serving as the Office of Refugee Resettlement Division Director for Refugee Assistance, which is responsible for oversight of the state-administered and state replacement designee refugee assistance programs, totaling approximately $400 million, which provide up to 8 months of cash and medical assistance and up to 5 years of support services for ORR's eligible populations. Karl has worked with the Federal Department of Health and Human Services Administration. Hey, Karl. We also have Donna Duvin, who is currently serving as Executive Director of the International Rescue Committee in San Diego. Her professional nonprofit career spans over 25 years, including a Peace Corps assignment developing health and welfare programs in Tonga. Her experience also includes 17 years in leading territories in California and Michigan as CEO and regional CEO for the American Red Cross. In 2018, she proudly joined the IRC San Diego as the executive director. In this position, Donna oversees the IRC's operations and has helped more than 8,000 refugees, asylees, asylum seekers, secondary migrants, victims of human trafficking, and other low-income individuals to rebuild their lives and thrive in San Diego just in the past year. And finally, we have Ramla Sahid, who's the founder and executive director at PANA. She's currently on maternity leave, but we were able to rope her in for this special event. Ramla has overseen the organization's growth and prominence as it has skyrocketed in the past few years to become one of San Diego's most important civic engagement and advocacy organizations. She regularly speaks at conferences on power building and leveraging community voices to achieve equitable outcomes for families. So thank you all three of you for joining us today. I wanted to start the discussion by first asking Ramla, reflecting on this report and your experience working with refugee communities. We've seen so many issues that refugees face upon resettlement. How do you believe we could address some of these disparities? Oh, you're on mute, Ramla.
Thanks, Samira. And thank you, Janine, for giving us that really great overview of the findings. Of course, my experience is informed by my family's resettlement in this country, first in Dallas, Texas, and then secondarily in San Diego, where we've had to figure out life. Can any of you imagine being resettled in a foreign country where you don't speak the language, and within 90 days, you're expected to pay rent and be self-sufficient? And that is the really unrealistic expectations we put on families when we resettle families. When they're initially resettled, they are immediately faced with barriers to healthy housing, family-sustaining jobs, and quality education. This is because the Refugee Act of 1980 prioritizes immediate employment as the foremost priority. With a very minimal or no English, families are pushed into workforce to find any job, depriving them of opportunities to enhance their long-term well-being and belonging. This approach is short-sighted, and we're all realizing that, and we're all becoming advocates for a better process. Because when we do that, when we push families into any job and low-wage work, it of course traps people into a vicious circle of poverty, forcing parents like mine to hold multiple low-wage work to just afford rent, and then still having to spend more than 50% of their income on rent. A focus on early workforce participation comes at the expense of missing out on opportunities, including skills training, certifications, or recertifying degrees from their home country. I have an uncle who had a master's degree when we arrived, and he couldn't use it. And there's no in-depth language support, which if increased, could support long-term financial benefits because you have better access to job opportunities. It's a forced choice between paying rent or tapping into training and education opportunities. And so during the initial resettlement process, the other thing that happens is you receive temporary support, temporary assistance. This assistance often only covers rent for the first 3 months if we're lucky upon resettlement. Refugees are, as a result, among the hidden homeless. And this is something we talk a lot about at PANA. As a result of being among the hidden homeless, it means individuals who cannot afford shelter but are not physically on the streets due to family and community networks are basically doubling up or tripling up, living in dangerously overcrowded and substandard conditions, making them vulnerable to eviction and abuse from landlords. And Janine just talked about, the complications that also brings when you have a global pandemic, right? As a country, when we resettle refugees, we know who we're resettling. You know, we get to choose who we resettle. And we know we're resettling some of the world's most vulnerable individuals and people. These are individuals who have spent years and sometimes decades in refugee camps with very little or no education or interrupted education, people who survive extreme adversities and trauma. So we have an obligation to ensure they are supported to successfully rebuild upon resettlement. And I think housing is one of the biggest challenges that hasn't been tackled, that needs to be tackled. Resettlement agencies, of course, do the absolute best that they can. They hustle, they find and build relationships with landlords. They have to deal with newcomer families who have zero credit, but landlords who are expecting 3 times the income of the rents, plus a credit score and no eviction record and all of these other requirements. So I think caseworkers are basically told to be superheroes and given very little resources to do it. And so it's home than just a place of shelter. We know where we live influences every aspect of our lives. As policy people in the room and as advocates in the room, it's really critical that we're all pushing for additional investments, particularly that the Refugee Act is updated to mandate and provide affordable housing as a necessary tool when we resettle families, and ensure that we have the funding available in this country to ensure resettlement agencies can help families get into healthy, affordable homes where we aren't dealing with issues of either overcrowding or horrible conditions because the landlords are, slumlords, and that's the only type of home you can afford with the income that you're making. So that's I'll stop there and just kind of say that, for me, I think housing is really key, underpins everything else. If you've got a shelter that you don't have to worry about, then you can focus a little bit more time in education, in supporting children, doing well in school, in upskilling your workforce, in night classes. But those opportunities are sort of taken away from you when you're sort of forced to forced to hold multiple jobs just to be able to afford rent that you really can't afford in the first place. So thank you.
Thank you, Ramla. Well, Ramla, you gave us a little bit of an intro of, what are the issues that refugees first face. However, I mean, the Office of Refugee Resettlement takes on the bulk of, making sure that refugees, when they're coming, are supported, right? And they get that initial investment. Karl, I would love for you to give us a brief overview of the refugee resettlement process when someone arrives in the United States, and how ORR functions as within the federal departments, as well as if you can give us any updates on what we can anticipate in the refugee resettlement process within the new administration. I know that we're hoping for for a new day within refugee resettlement.
Thank you, Humara. And first, I just want to say that I'm very pleased to be participating as a panelist, and thank you very much. This is a great conversation, and we're all very excited to restore the refugee program. So what I would like to do is just give you a little bit of background on the ORR's role in resettlement process and how we work with other federal agencies. And then a little bit of the new administration and some of the priorities that has been outlined in the White House website. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, but I'm not sure if everybody is totally familiar with how we operate. So I'm not going to try to go too much into the weeds, but just enough that folks understand how we operate. So the US Refugee Program, it's really a partnership among 3 federal agencies. The Department of Homeland Security, they are responsible for the overseas vetting of folks that come here as refugees. Do they meet the definition of a refugee? And also we talk about vetting. The Department of Homeland Security, they do the security screening. And again, sometimes when I give these speeches, I think I'm preaching to the choir. We often hear, well, refugees come, how do we know that they aren't going to come here and do mischief? It's the most vetted program of any immigrant that comes to the United States. On average, it's about 24 months before to come here. There's multiple reviews and checks and rechecks, both from the work that's done by Homeland Security and also the processing centers that are also overseas that work with the State Department. So again, the second federal agency that we work very close with and most close with at ORR is the Department of State, Population, Refugees, and Migration. They are responsible for really bringing the refugees to this country, determining what the working with the administration on the allocation, the PD, the annual consultation. So the groups of refugees that come here, and then bringing refugees here in partnership with, and again, this is a public-private partnership, working with the 9 national resettlement agencies to come to the United States, working with the International Organization of Migration, IOM, the flights, getting them here. And then on the domestic side, and where ORR and PRM intersect is PRM does what we call the initial reception and placement program. It's a 30 to 90-day program where when a refugee comes, they're picked up at the airport, they are brought to their first apartment, there is basic necessities, food, furniture, and also the initial referrals for children to be enrolled in school, for medical screening, for social security number, for referrals to the basic assistance. So basic needs are met during that period. Then during that period, I'm with the Department of Health and Human Services. HHS is responsible for the domestic program, intersecting with PRM during that first 30 days. Then the longer term resettlement that occurs. And then we are the facilitator working with states, local government, and a whole host of non-governmental organizations. It's more the longer term basic assistance we provide to refugees and longer term integration. Basic assistance that ORR does provide. So hearkening back to the Refugee Act, as Ramla talked a little bit about that, we, in a lot of ways, our assistance, we're kind of the program of last resort, at least on the assistance side. And what does that mean? Refugees are legally eligible for the same assistance as US citizens, as long as they meet the same categorical and financial eligibility requirements. So refugees are eligible for the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. That's basic cash assistance. Many of the old timers here would remember that as the AFDC program. And also for Medicaid, basic health insurance. Now most federal means tested programs are designed categorically to have a minor child in the case. So then the question, what do we do with singles and couples without, married couples without minor children? Well, that's kind of where ORR comes in. So that's where we provide what we call refugee cash assistance, refugee medical assistance for those cohorts of refugees that are ineligible for federal means tested programs. And right now we provide up to 8 months. Now, even before my time, which is many years ago, as Humaira kind of gave my background, when the program started, we, at the very beginnings in the early 80s, we provided up to 36 months of cash and medical assistance. Then it got ratcheted down over the years, down to 24 months, down to 18 months, down to 12 months. And since 1991, it's been an 8-month program. And that's kind of where we've been. It's been stable at 8 months since 1991. So in order to help refugees ensure that they can succeed, they need temporary assistance, they need resources while they're participating in basic employability skills and other support services. So the other main program that ORR provides is refugee support services. That's employment, case management, English as a second language, skills training. We provide those funds based on a formula to states and state replacement designees. According to our regs, folks are eligible for up to 5 years, but we've been providing a lot of waivers during COVID. So we've extended the 5-year period. We've extended the 8-month cash and medical during COVID. So right now we've opened up the program, and we'll see what happens post-COVID. Maybe this will provide some sort of gateway to extending these time periods if we get support by the administration. But I think many folks have questioned, is 8 months really enough? Having support services longer than 5 years as needed. We also have a host of discretionary grant programs that go directly to non-governmental organizations that are designed more to fill a gap in the refugee services. We have a whole host of services. Some of you may be familiar with individual development accounts, which is a forced savings account, micro enterprise loan program, which helps entrepreneurial refugees maybe save money for a business, or since many are, we have a micro enterprise childcare program, as many refugees don't feel comfortable sending their children to, let's say, a center, but would work within their community to maybe have somebody become licensed, and you could have someone within your community watch your child while you could work. We have a preferred communities, intensive case management, career pathways, which is designed more for higher skilled refugees, a refugee agricultural partnership program for many folks that come, especially older refugees that came from agrarian societies, survivors of torture. So we have other programs that work with our core assistance. And also I need to say that many of you know, but we say refugee program, we have other populations. We go beyond the PRM mandate that serves refugees and special immigrant visa holders from Afghanistan and Iraq. Other populations are also eligible for refugee assistance to the same extent as refugees, primarily those individuals who are granted asylum, and Cuban Haitian entrants are eligible for refugee assistance to the same extent as refugees, and also certified victims of trafficking. So ORR's mandate has grown over the years from the refugees to slightly thereafter to serving Cuban Haitian entrants, to those granted asylum, to SIVs from Afghanistan and Iraq and victims of trafficking. So that's kind of the ORR and what we do. And it's very important. We really look at this program as a public-private partnership. It's one of our other key programs that many from the resettlement agencies are very familiar with is the Match Grant Program. And that's another gateway to provide assistance to newly arrived refugees 3 ways: Refugee Cash Assistance Program, the Temporary Assistance for Families Program, TANF, and the Matching Grant, which is pretty much a welfare diversion program where refugees would then go through Match Grant, and the Match Grant agency has to provide match resources from the community, both in cash and in kind. But that's really another great way to bring in community support for the refugee program. And then maybe a minute on this, for the current administration, and then I'll stop there because I'm sure, Humara, you have other questions. No. So the Biden administration has really put a great priority on capacity building and strengthening the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, with the commitment, many of you might have heard this term, to build back better. So I have been with the program many years, and I think I'm with my 10th political director. And one of the things that was a bit disappointing for me, this is personally, over the last 4 years, is the refugee program was always one of these programs that was supported, was one of these little programs that had support, what I would, from a bipartisan basis. It was not a Republican program. It was not a Democratic program. And that was one of the reasons even when we had budget shortfalls, ORR typically would be fully funded. Now, albeit it could be for different reasons. Maybe on one side would be more for humanitarian reasons. Maybe on from a different approach, it met our foreign policy objectives for why we support refugees from certain countries that came from former communist countries. But regardless, there was a broad coalition of support for the refugee program. And to some extent, that was lost a little bit in the last 4 years. And for me, that was very disappointing because it was never a politicized program. It was a program that had widespread support from both Democrats and Republicans. And I think that was really key to what I would say the success of the program. And we were always looked at as a model program. It's interesting where we are situated. So I said ORR is part of HHS. We're an operating division within the Administration for Children and Families. So the other programs, as key programs that many of you are probably familiar with, are the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, the Child Care Block Grant program, the Head Start program. So it's not by happenstance ORR was put in HHS and ACF. It was designed to piggyback and work with other mainstream programs to assist refugees. And often when we work with our counterparts in the TANF program, they're under the Office of Family Assistance, we were always pointed out as a model program. How do you get your refugees jobs so quickly? They become so self-sufficient so quickly. Our programs operate in many county assistance offices, and I've done many monitorings and site visits over the years. I met with many eligibility workers, and they would often say, my favorite clients are the refugees. They're so committed, they're so resilient, they want to work hard, and also how our focus is on employment and self-sufficiency, very motivated to have outcomes that make it easy for us to get this political support, because we always had good information. Our refugees, they come here, they go to work, which dispels a myth that some anti-immigrant folks have. Oh, they come here and they go on welfare. Well, when I've had that discussion with some folks, I said, who would come here to be on welfare? I showed them the TANF monthly cash assistance rates in many states that are, you can't live on that money. So nobody in their right mind would come here to be on welfare. You can't. So again, very motivated, very, and really work very hard. And so again, with the Biden administration, building back better, we need to really rebuild some of the capacity that was lost over the last few years, the local resettlement capacity, not to mention the overseas pipeline, which has been diminished. I mentioned already the polarized political environment that creates unique challenges. So these are some of the things we have to overcome. The Biden administration, in their White House information in their website, the plan is to bring in 125,000 refugees. So if you think of where we are, we may have to build up to that because our capacity can't get there right away. Currently, a presidential determination has not been signed, so we're going to wait to see what it'll be for this year and next year. So even if it is the 125 total, we may not have the underpinnings to get there, but that would be the plan, to build up to 125. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, under the last year of President Obama, we got up to 85,000, and that was a major surge in the program. Now, aspirationally, the PD 2017 would have gone up to 110,000, but we never got there based on what happened in January of 2017. So the administration is very committed to building much higher numbers, but hopefully sustainable growth too, and then building back that political support for the program. And I think that is absolutely key to the program. I'm going to stop here because I don't want to take up more time.
No, thank you, Karl. That was definitely helpful. And of course, we have all been hearing, as a campaign promise of the Biden administration, that the numbers of refugee resettlement would grow exponentially up to 125,000 in the first year of the presidency. So we're still anticipating it. We're hoping for it, but understand that the infrastructure that would need to be built to expand that program again to pre-Trump levels. And so, Ms. Duvin, I would love to hear from you. I mean, in anticipation of this growth, how is your agency preparing this increase of resettled refugees? And how can cities like San Diego better prepare and coordinate our local response? You're on mute.
Yep.
There you go.
Thank you. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if I didn't do that at some point. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. Number one, I just want to applaud PANA for this gathering and for the survey that you had conducted. I think it's a very exciting but a very important time for being able to step back and look at, what we need to include in our planning and how we can move forward on various policy issues in order to support the refugee resettlement program that's currently underway. But equally important, I think, was knowing that the survey was based on refugee voices themselves, letting us know rather than making those assumptions where their greatest challenges come from. And so I think from this point forward, I would really encourage anyone who is working to support refugees or refugee resettlement going forward, that we all make a commitment to include refugee clients in planning discussions and in calibrating our programs with their input involved, which I think is critically important. Obviously, the challenges that were presented in the survey are cross-cutting, and they're significant, with housing being front and center, as Ramla had shared. And we can get into that more in depth, but I do think that when we're thinking about the great opportunity of rebuilding or building towards greater capacity, it's a conversation that's wonderful to see happening after 4 years of figuring out how we can maintain a core infrastructure of resettlement agencies just to be able to stay afloat, so that in the day, hopefully when that was turned around, we would be present and still able to serve incoming refugees. So a lot of our conversations have really focused around, again, how can we not only plan as individual agencies receiving refugees, but how we can do that more collectively. The IRC routinely part in quarterly consultation meetings with stakeholders. Stakeholders represent a wide variety of community constituents. So everything from involving city representatives to county reps to public education, public safety, housing, we can get them to the table. Employers and benefit folks who are all needing to be in lockstep coordination on how we rebuild to receive a greater number of refugees. So it's not only our planning internally to our organization, but we want to make sure, again, that our entire community is thinking about what they need to be doing in order to further prepare for an increased number of foreign-born individuals coming into our hands. And it really does take the entire village to make this lift. And so we're excited to have those partners at the table with us, but always looking to increase the partners who are at the table, not only to talk about what is coming, but the question of where are the gaps and concerns that we see as being the greatest challenges to having overall capacity for serving refugees. At the IRC on our end, we have taken some very strategic steps to look at our need for increased capacity. We are adding staffing right now as we speak to begin to rebuild to that. That includes also adding a housing navigator to our team to make sure that that's a priority function that we can really provide adequate attention to. Increasing the number of interpreters that we have on board with us, and certainly reaching out to our many employers and housing partners to make sure that they're in readiness to work alongside of us too, since their participation is key to welcoming refugees into the mix. And I would just say that those conversations locally extend all the way up the line, that I've been most gratified, I think, during this period to see that the collaboration, not only at the local level, but certainly all up and down the county and the state levels, and also in concert with our federal partners, is one that seems to be happening simultaneously with a lot of cross threads of how we can help each other to cover those critical gaps. And so I think every agency has got their role to play, but the one thing we can do is to advocate for comprehensive solutions that will really not leave the refugee needs on the table. So I'm excited to see this opportunity at the fore, and this conversation today is very much a part of that.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I think that I was hearing some feedback, but that sounds good. Yeah, I appreciate you stating that, because I agree that it's definitely very much of an integrative process between different agencies, between nonprofit agencies, as well as advocacy organizations like ours, thinking about how do we continue to do better for the refugee community? How do we continue to build on the foundations that we have to ensure that our refugee communities are being supported? Karl, really quickly, maybe just like in a minute, I hope you all can hear me. Did my internet go out for a minute?
No, we're good. We're good.
All right. Sounds good. Just making sure. I'm wondering, there's a lot of, challenges that refugees are facing, but there's a lot of success stories as well. I mean, PEN is one example, right? We're a refugee-led organization doing this work. And in your years of experience, I would love to know, as refugees are on this path to success, I think you did a great job of talking about like the robustness of some of these programs, but I'd also know what are the barriers you're facing as a governmental agency trying to support refugees?
I think one of the challenges, and I know I need to keep this to a minute. I mean, one of the challenges, we're a bifurcated program in a way. It's across federal agencies. We have great partnership. We work well with PRM, but sometimes that's challenging. If you think about refugees come through one program, but then there's a baton to another federal agency, and it really proposes some challenges for coordination, streamlined services, and we do our best. We work great with PRM. But often, even as a refugee, you come in with the RMP program, but then you make a transfer to the RSS program. And it's sometimes, it just creates a little bit more effort and work in terms of the bifurcated nature. Also, the different streams that you could come into the program. If you're a newly arrived refugee, well, we're not funded to serve all refugees. So if you're eligible for TANF, you go into TANF, and there's many good TANF programs. So I'm not in any way trying to throw TANF under the bus. There's some really great TANF programs, but you could see the bifurcation. If you're a refugee family, you go into TANF, but if you're a single refugee, you go into RCA, or if there's a match grant program, you go into that program. And you could be within the same family, and you might have someone on TANF, RCA, and match grant, and they're still, from our perspective, you're a refugee. You're a refugee. But even we tend to segment them. Oh, you're a TANF type, you're an RCA type, you're a match grant. But in reality, you're a refugee with similar needs. Other challenges, of course, will always be funding. If to grow the program, we're going to need to support and resources to ensure that we could support our partners, our NGOs, our states, our replacement designees. We need the resources to basically provide the robust employability services, make sure we don't have wait lists. We're mandated to provide up to 5 years of services, but if in the past when we've had a surge, states would inform us, we could have really only served the new arrivals. We don't have enough resources to provide resources longer term. And then staffing. I mean, we have to rebuild the structure that was in some ways decimated over the last 4 years, both with the RAs. So we lost some institutional knowledge, bringing back folks, and even the pipeline, the refugee pipeline, even from the Department of Homeland Security, the circuit riders, all that has to be built back up again. And there's a training. So people don't become experts on day one. They get that experience. And so those are at least a few of the challenges that I see. And I kept it to maybe 2 minutes.
I appreciate that. No, I think that's really helpful to understand the challenges that exist. And I the funding challenge is definitely a question when we look at San Diego as well. I mean, so much of the funding is that we rely upon is federal funding, right? And so for us, we consistently think about how can we continue to invest in refugees. We're in California, we're in a border community, right? How do we continue to make sure that we are investing in folks, maybe, not only those initial, newcomer families, but the ones who have been here longer who continue to struggle. So that's definitely really helpful. And as we think about this, I would love maybe for Rumla, if you could start us off with thinking about, if you were to reimagine resettlement in the United States, what are some of the top things that you would like to see implemented at the local, state, and federal level to facilitate long-term belonging and self-sufficiency for refugees? Still on mute.
Okay. It's one of my favorite questions, Samaida, because we have to think about what it looks like to envision a world where people are doing well, and part of that is we got to invest in people so they can do well. And so it's my favorite question because it allows us to live in a place of, what do people what do we need to give people? What do we need to do to support people where we're not sort of restricted by, our little, our bureaucracies, our boxes or whatever. So if we can just, if I were to have this conversation with folks, I would say that, first I would echo Donna's earlier sentiment that this is an exciting time. We've got a new administration that's excited to do more and wants to do more for refugees. And so we've got to challenge them to dream big when it comes to that. So we're not stuck in the traditional cycles that we've been in the past. It's time to move away from the harmful rhetoric that we've seen over the last 5.5 years, 6 years, that has really not only stifled our ability to reimagine resettlement, but has really shrunk the program. What the past 5.5 years has taught us is how vulnerable the refugee program is, right? And how much more we need to have and build advocates to help sustain the program and grow the program year after year, and not just when we're in crisis mode. So some of the things I would prioritize, one is, reducing the mandate and emphasis on immediate employment. And I think, just giving families the opportunity to participate in education and training opportunities, that pathway into family sustaining jobs, that should be the priority, right? Because when you get here, you don't have networks, you don't have social capital, you don't have the expertise to navigate complicated job centers. You don't have the 8th grade reading level that you need to understand, how to access these resources. And you certainly don't speak English. So really, that would be one. At the county level, what that means is that we pass the county refugee employment services plan every 3 years. And so there we can really make sure the education and employment training programs we're recommending are actually real opportunities, offer real opportunities to pathway into family sustaining jobs, not just another way to give people, any job. The other thing is county governments don't invest right now in refugee resettlement. We invest zero. We take basically what the ORR resources are given to us from the state and we re-administer them. And so as a county that's really wealthy and doing well, I think it's important for us to consider what can we do from our own county budgets to ensure that families that we resettle here can be supported in the ways that they need to do well.
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rumla. I appreciate that. Donna, I'd love to ask you the same question. And for the audience, please feel free to start putting your questions into the chat. We'd love to address those as well. I know we don't have a ton of time. If it's okay if we go about 5 over, that would be amazing. But Donna, I'd love to hand it off to you in terms of how would you reimagine resettlement and what would be your top priorities?
Well, I think, really, again, being able to hold to the commitment that we're all making to welcome refugees and certainly to expand the number that we're providing that opportunity here in this country is a very good beginning. The commitment has been made by the federal government, and recently the state has also passed a bill that affirms again the welcoming community and welcome and support that they intend to give refugees moving forward. So that's a very strong commitment. I would also say that one of the things that Karl mentioned that I thought was quite intriguing is how discombobulated it can be to try to look at all the various different programs that are available to serve refugees. And you can just imagine if that's happening at the higher levels with organizations and departments working together. You can only imagine how confusing that is to a refugee family who's trying to access those services and don't know exactly what's going to best suit them or where they fit into those programs. And so one of the things that we are really advocating for, especially here in the state of California, is for some element of extended case management. What this really means is instead of somebody coming to our doors, for instance, and describing their problem to 8 people before they get to the right program to serve them, they would go back to their initial caseworker whom they've already received support with and who knows their situation. And they'll continue to work and have access to case manager for up to 2 years during that initial phase when they're trying to determine what are the best pathways to follow, where are the opportunities. And so we are really hoping that that's something that whether it's the state or even whether it's ORR, that's a model that could be considered, because it's that longer term support initially that's going to be a very important investment in front load in the support and the success of newly resettled families. I would say too that upward mobility continues to be a real concern of ours. We've seen some progress over this last year, especially here in California. There was a bill that was passed that enables refugees and asylees to have an accelerated pathway to receiving recertification and licensing that they had in their home countries, which is a really important advance to people who really want to be able to provide for their families, some with great skills and can't apply them otherwise. Similarly, investing in career development programs in general, which give people a longer time in which to explore those career opportunities and provide them with the training that would really make them position them for the next job opportunity out. So we strongly advocate for those opportunities as well. And lots of other things I can think of along the way, but those are the 2 big ones. And housing is preeminent. I mean, I just think anything we can do to address housing as a primary and basic concern would go a long way to stabilizing families when they're most against the clock and worried about their futures. When we look at the mental health statistics that were laid out in the survey, mental health is very much related to the concerns of whether or not people have a roof over their head and can meet their basic needs. If you have those basic needs met, many of those health care and mental health concerns are diminished and they're able to cope quite well. But it's pretty overwhelming when you're concerned about how you're going to feed your family or house them.
Agreed. Thank you so much. Those were great examples. And yeah, even when we've seen like uptick of violence in the home and things like that through COVID, so much of that can also be just related to the stressors that are put on refugee families as it relates to housing. Karl, I would love for you to also answer that. And then there's also a question from the audience around what would we change about refugee resettlement and how it's funded and supported to ensure critical infrastructure isn't gutted and jeopardized in future administrations. Like you said, historically, this has been a bipartisan issue, but we recognize that now, it was more vulnerable than we thought. And how can we make sure that we're setting up the funding and the infrastructure needed to really keep the program whole, despite the administrations that come in and out?
So, again, answering the question first on what would really assist long-term resettlement and effective resettlement. I think the key, and some of it you've said, Ramla and Donna, is we really need a holistic approach to resettlement. It really needs to be strength-based, not what did they take? They go to the welfare office, but we're speaking to the choir. Refugees really add a lot to this country, and when folks don't believe us, just go to employers who are not necessarily traditional allies of a program. They may be indifferent, but there's so many adjectives I could describe. So the holistic approach, strength-based messaging are really important refugees are resilient. They have just resilient and have a great perspective and great work habits. And you know, from the resettlement agencies in the last 4 years, the phones are ringing off the hook. Where are our refugees? They're our best workers. We need them. Why aren't they coming? And so I think messaging is really important. A holistic approach to resettlement. We really need to focus on the whole family, not just parts of the family. That's also part of the Administration for Children and Families multifaceted generational approach to two-gen approach to looking at the needs of the family. And so we really need to look at the family, not only in employment, but those who have health or mental health needs and the family supports that they need to integrate. It's just really important. One of the things we're doing in ORR within on the refugee side is we're working with states to put a new an enhanced family self-sufficiency planning, where it's really kind of like a case management to make sure there's a baseline of services that we ensure that refugees receive. It attaches to the employable adult, but then and their family members to really ensure that they're getting a baseline of an initial assessment, referral, and follow-up. That's really important. So really the messaging, the whole family approach are really keys to a holistic approach to all the needs of the refugee family, not just the employment. And I know, Ramla, you made that comment. We agree. I mean, so some of it does come down to funding, but to really integrate, and you really need to look at the entire needs of the family.
And then in terms of, I guess, that funding question, did you have any thoughts in terms of like, how do we build out that long-term infrastructure?
So I don't know if I'm talking for me or for ORR. I don't want to get ahead of, but I think there needs to be some sort of, you know, if you're going to bring in more folks, there needs to be a kind of a, it needs to be connected to some sort of methodology. I mean, one of the challenges we had was when we had the surge back in 2016, the RSS funding was straight-lined. So we had a lot of challenges with our states and local partners. How do we do everything we're supposed to do if the resources are not commensurate with the number of people? So I think somehow funding has to be tied to people. And I don't think I'm going to get in trouble or get out in front of ORR by saying that, because otherwise if we bring in exponentially more people in the funding, I mean, I'm talking on the services side, that really does, that really sets us up for a challenge on how are we successful in helping refugees become economically self-sufficient and integrate. If we don't have the tools to do it, it comes down to funding. So I think there needs to be some connection on the RSS side, refugee support services, of people. So that would be my recommendation. And I think I'll be in good stead in my program by saying that.
Thank you. And I appreciate you saying that, because, you know, Imam Taha is a prominent imam in San Diego, and he remembers in 2016, or was it 2015, where, you know, there were literally refugees coming in and, you know, coming to the mosque and knocking on his door looking for shelter, because the refugee settlement organizations were scrambling, right, to find people housing and shelter. And we're trying to find hotels for people. And, you know, how can we make sure that as we ramp up, we aren't facing those challenges? And I know we are at time, a little bit over, but Donna, if you'd like to respond to that question as well, or Ramla, I'd like to give really quick opportunity for you to do so.
I'll just say that I know that funding is always an issue, and we look at every creative way possible in order to fund the programs that we're making available. I would say that there's one other piece of the Biden administration plan that we find very heartening. We're not sure exactly how it's going to play yet, but we think it's a great opportunity for engaging the broader community. And that really is returning and really emphasizing the public-private partnership that enables this program to move forward. It's always been assumed that the host community was also going to wrap its resources and its arms around newly arriving refugees. And so there's a lot of discussion underway now about restarting some element of a community sponsorship model, which enables more people from our community to really surround refugee families when they initially arrive, or even for an extended period of time, to provide them with some of that connectivity to the community that resettlement agencies or other institutions may not have the resources to provide. And that's really, you know, it's that welcoming committee, if you will, that stays with that family over a longer period of time and begins to build that community-based level of support that we really want to see for a family. So they're not just coming to a resettlement agency, but they really feel a part of the community and welcomed here. So I think that's a big part of our discussion moving forward, is how can we really enable the broader community to be a part of this process when we know that people are eager to do so. And we just want to put the right protections in place so that refugee families are well protected in that process, and that those who are assisting them also have a good understanding of their role in that process.
Thank you for that. Ramla, did you want to respond? Or I know we're almost at time, so.
No, I really appreciate Karl, spot on. I think, yeah, we need to advocate for more resources, and that's definitely a congressional thing. So for our folks in the audience who work at congressional offices, let's have the conversation. Let's continue the conversation about how we make sure resettlement is fully funded and supported in the ways that we need, in the ways that we need it to be, so that families are set up for success. And then for our county folks, I know there are a lot of county folks in the room. One, refugee employment services plan is critical. Let's make sure that that services plan actually has education and employment training opportunities that actually pathway into family sustaining jobs, right? These are jobs who pay a housing wage. The other is, like, a county can afford to invest in refugee resettlement. I know not all counties are privileged enough to do that, right? Or want to do that, because you've got several states who have passed anti-refugee legislation, right? But California is one of the most welcoming. San Diego is a welcoming community. And so really making sure, what does that actually mean, and how do we make that meaningful in terms of how we show up for people and how we invest in newcomer families so that they're set up for success. Because, you know, the reality is, if we can help refugee families succeed, then there is no reason why we should be failing any of our families, right? Because refugees are literally coming into this country with, you know, some of them zero English, though with skill, some of them with skills. You know, there's a lot of diversity within the refugee population. And so that's what I would say is, like, let's help families by supporting them and their long-term success. And that requires investment from our local government as well. And that's not been a conversation we've had in the past. I think Kamira jumped off. Oh no. Yeah, I think
No, I'm still here. I apologize. I'm having some unstable internet, but thank you so much. Thank you for all of our panelists and for all of our participants, for joining this discussion today. I think it was really great to have all of you here today. We will be following up with a recording of today's briefings. If you have any of your colleagues or other staff that were not able to attend, we do encourage you to share it and reach out to us if you have any more questions. Karl, Donna, I'd love for you to also put your contact information chat in case we want this to be really a starting point for future discussions. So we look forward to, continuing this conversation and implementing policies that can center the dignity of refugee communities. So please enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a great weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.